Welcome and thank you for joining me. We're drifting into another remarkable moment in history. Please like, share, and subscribe, and let me know in the comments what time it is, where you are, and the place you're watching from. I love seeing viewers from every corner of the world. Thank you. Imagine the sound first. Before you even see Amsterdam in the early 1600s, you hear it, the creak of wooden masts rubbing against one another in the harbor, the shouts of sailors in half a dozen languages calling instructions across the docks, the splash of oars dipping into dark canal water. Somewhere nearby, a church bell marks the hour, and then a cart rattles over cobblestones, iron rims clattering in a steady rhythm. Then you notice the smell, a strange blend of fresh-baked bread drifting from a nearby bakery, smoke from peat fires curling into the winter sky, the salty temps of the sea, and the less pleasant scent of fish, tar, and animals that live close to humans. For a visitor arriving by ship, Amsterdam seems both overwhelming and orderly at the same time. The canals don't wander, they curve with careful precision. Streets intersect at neat angles. Warehouses sit in disciplined rows, and the citizens move with purpose, as if everyone has somewhere important to be. This was Amsterdam at the dawn of the Dutch Golden Age, a city that had risen astonishingly fast. Only a few generations earlier, it had been a modest trading town in the marshlands, but by 1600, it had transformed into one of the most dynamic and wealthy urban centers in the world, drawing attention, envy, and curiosity from far-off lands. To walk its streets was to feel that history itself was in motion. At sunrise, long before most cities would begin to stir, Amsterdam was already awake. Barges glided through the canals, carrying goods that came from astonishing distances: barrels of herring from the North Sea, bales of wool from England, exotic spices from Asia, cinnamon, pepper, cloves, their fragrances drifting through market squares as workers hauled crates onto carts. Ships from the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, towered at the docks, crewed by men who had sailed vast oceans and endured storms, hunger, disease, and months of isolation. These ships didn't just bring wealth, they brought stories, objects, new foods, new illnesses, and the constant reminder that the world was far larger than anyone had imagined a century earlier. Merchants walked the streets with account books tucked under their arms, minds filled with calculations, profit margins, cargo values, the risks of voyages, the possibility that a single lost ship could erase years of investment. They met in taverns, not to drink idly, but to negotiate deals. One table might carry on a hushed discussion about a shipment of sugar from Brazil, while at the next, men debated the future price of tulips or grain. Coffee, newly popular and bitter to unfamiliar palates, became a fashionable way to stay alert. Tobacco smoke curled through the air as men discussed ships, storms, politics, and the uncertain fortunes of the markets. But one of the surprises of 1600s Amsterdam was how little it resembled the glamorous fantasy some might imagine. Yes, it was wealthy, but much of its wealth was poured back into warehouses, canals, tools, and orderly ledgers filled with careful writing. The city did not shine with the excesses of royal courts. It grew through discipline, careful planning, and countless everyday routines. For ordinary citizens, life meant structure. The city itself reflected that structure in every brick and canal. Amsterdam had expanded in rings, each canal carefully dug, each block arranged with surprising precision. Houses rose tall and narrow, their facades decorated with carved gables that looked almost like crowns. Taxes were based on width, so buildings climbed upward, their upper floors leaning slightly forward, making it easier to haul goods up with winches attached to beams. From below, ropes squeaked as crates and furniture swung upward past windows. Inside those homes, the world slowed down into private rhythms. A mother swept dust toward the door with a straw broom. A child scrubbed steps with sand and water until they looked almost white. A servant polished pewter plates until they gleamed, the reflections shimmering in the low light. Guests might think such efforts obsessive, but in Amsterdam, cleanliness wasn't just about hygiene, it carried moral meaning. A clean home signaled discipline, self-control, and virtue. A dirty one suggested laziness and possible moral weakness. Women took particular pride in this order, and many spent hours each day maintaining it. Outside, water was everywhere. Canals weren't just beautiful, they were arteries through which the city lived. Goods traveled by boat more often than by cart, making it easier to move heavy loads without damaging the streets. Children leaned over bridges to watch fish swim beneath them. Fishermen cast lines quietly at dawn. Sometimes, in cold winters, the canals froze solid, turning into glittering highways for skaters. People would glide across the ice in great numbers, men, women, children, and occasionally a dog, chasing after them laughing despite the bitter cold. Yet for all its charm, Amsterdam was not romantic in the way later centuries would imagine. It could be harsh. Wealth existed, but it was surrounded by constant risk. A merchant could gain riches from one successful voyage and lose everything the next year. Ships were fragile against storms, pirates, and unpredictable winds. Families waited months for news, sometimes learning that husbands, fathers, and sons would never return. Widows, some young, found themselves suddenly responsible for households and debts. In marketplaces, voices rose in bargaining, the dialects of Europe mixing into a lively, multilingual noise. Fishmongers displayed their catch on wooden tables, the smell strong and unavoidable. Bakers sold warm loaves, their crusts crackling. Cheese wheels sat stacked like golden wheels in shop windows. Children ran between stalls, laughing or being scolded for getting in the way. Beggars waited on the edges, hoping someone generous or guilty might spare a coin. The sheer diversity of people would surprise a visitor. Amsterdam had become a refuge for many who had nowhere else to go. Jews fleeing persecution in Spain and Portugal arrived quietly, rebuilding their communities. French Huguenots escaped religious violence and sought safer lives. German craftsmen crossed borders in search of work, bringing skills that made the city stronger. Sailors from Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean passed through, leaving faint traces of foreign languages and new ideas. The city prided itself on tolerance, not perfect equality, but a relatively open attitude that set it apart from many European cities. As long as people contributed, worked, and did not openly challenge the fragile balance of order, they were usually allowed to stay. Still, this tolerance did not erase tension. Suspicion lingered beneath politeness. Religious disagreements simmered. Political debates could quickly become heated, but the guiding principle was pragmatic. Trade depended on stability, and so did everyone's livelihood. That practical mindset shaped much of Amsterdam's culture. Rather than relying on nobility or kings, the city functioned through councils, guilds, and citizens invested in keeping things orderly. Inside taverns, men leaned close over wooden tables. Deals were sealed with handshakes and witnesses rather than elaborate ceremonies. Some discussions turned to science, philosophy, and politics. New ideas drifted in from across Europe as printing presses spread information faster than ever before. Books passed through hands, sometimes secretly. Certain ideas remained too dangerous to discuss openly. Yet, compared to other regions, Amsterdam allowed space for curiosity to survive. Daily life carried an undercurrent of constant work. Even seemingly quiet scenes masked effort. A woman knitting by a window was not idle. She was creating necessities. A boy sweeping the stoop was preserving the family's honor. A man loading barrels was performing a task crucial not just to his employer, but to entire chains of trade. People rarely imagined themselves as part of something grand, yet collectively they built one of the era's most powerful economies. As evening arrived, the city did not truly sleep. Lanterns flickered in windows. Taverns filled again, this time with songs and stories rather than business. Sailors told exaggerated tales of far-off islands and storms that nearly destroyed them. Young men boasted. Old men nodded silently, knowing too well which stories were true and which were fantasy. Outside, the canals reflected shimmering points of light, while water lapped quietly against stone. There were darker corners, too narrow alleys where crime waited for careless passersby, places where smugglers met in secret, homes where poverty nodded silently despite the appearance of success elsewhere. In those moments, the city reminded everyone that opportunity and danger lived side by side. But perhaps the most striking thing about Amsterdam was the confidence that filled it, not the arrogance of kings, but the determination of ordinary people convinced that through effort, organization, and cooperation they could shape their world. They built warehouses not for vanity, but for storage. They built canals not for decoration, but for function. They kept books and accounts because accuracy meant survival. And in the process, they created a city unlike any other. Visitors left, impressed and sometimes intimidated. They wrote letters home, describing the discipline, the busy markets, the endless activity. Some admired the balance between commerce and culture. Others worried that a city driven so much by money and trade might lose its soul. But to those who lived there, Amsterdam felt less like a moral puzzle, and daily life carried an undercurrent of constant work. Even seemingly quiet scenes masked effort. A woman knitting by a window was not idle, she was creating necessities. A boy sweeping the stoop was preserving the family's honor. A man loading barrels was performing a task crucial not just to his employer, but to entire chains of trade. People rarely imagined themselves as part of something grand, yet collectively they built one of the era's most powerful economies. As evening arrived, the city did not truly sleep. Lanterns flickered in windows. Taverns filled again, this time with songs and stories rather than business. Sailors told exaggerated tales of far-off islands and storms that nearly destroyed them. Young men boasted. Old men nodded silently, knowing too well which stories were true and which were fantasy. Outside, the canals reflected shimmering points of light, while water lapped quietly against stone. There were darker corners, too narrow alleys, where crime waited for careless passers-by, places where smugglers met in secret, homes where poverty nodded silently despite the appearance of success elsewhere. In those moments, the city reminded everyone that opportunity and danger lived side by side. But perhaps the most striking thing about Amsterdam was the confidence that filled it, not the arrogance of kings, but the determination of ordinary people convinced that through effort, organization, and cooperation they could shape their world. They built warehouses not for vanity, but for storage. They built canals not for decoration, but for function. They kept books and accounts because accuracy meant survival. And in the process, they created a city unlike any other. Visitors left, impressed and sometimes intimidated. They wrote letters home, describing the discipline, the busy markets, the endless activity. Some admired the balance between commerce and culture. Others worried that a city driven so much by money and trade might lose its soul. But to those who lived there, Amsterdam felt less like a moral puzzle and more like a fragile miracle, one that demanded constant effort to maintain. Every morning, households repeated their rituals. Every day, ships left and returned. Every evening, the bells tolled, marking the passage of time over a city that had grown from marshy ground into a vast experiment in urban ambition. And as night settled, a visitor might stand on a quiet bridge, listening to the gentle ripple of canal water, and realize that beneath the hustle, fear, wealth, and dreams, something deeper held the city together. The belief that through patience, ingenuity, and cooperation, ordinary people could build an extraordinary future. That was daily life in Amsterdam in the early 1600s. Not just a place of merchants and ships, but a living, breathing world where every sound, smell, and routine reflected the complex heartbeat of a city on the rise. Step inside a house in 1600s, Amsterdam, and the city changes. Outside, you saw the bustle of trade and industry. Inside, life becomes quieter, slower, and far more intimate, just as disciplined and purposeful. The first thing you notice is how narrow everything feels. The building rises tall and thin, squeezed between its neighbors, like books packed tightly on a shelf. This was no accident. Taxes were calculated by the width of the house facing the street. So families responded by building upward instead of outward. Floors stacked one on top of the other, connected by staircases so steep that they were almost ladders. If you're carrying something bulky, you don't even try to drag it up the stairs. You hoist it from the outside using the beam and hook that jut forward from the top of nearly every house designed for exactly that purpose. Don't open the front door and you may find yourself not in a living room, but in a shop or workshop. Many families lived where they worked. A cobbler's tools lay neatly arranged on a bench. A spice merchant stores fragrant sacks against the wall. A weaver's loom dominates the space, its wooden frame creaking rhythmically as threads move back and forth. Business and family life intertwine. Children grow up surrounded by the tools of their parents' trade, listening to the sounds of work from the moment they wake. Move further inside, and you enter the living quarter spaces that reveal how seriously people in Amsterdam treated order and appearance. Even simple homes show signs of careful attention. Floors are scrubbed so often that the wood looks pale and clean. Tiles line some walls, decorated in blue and white patterns that seem to tell small stories if you study them long enough. A polished brass warming pan hangs neatly on a peg. A broom stands ready near the door. It is impossible to ignore how clean everything is, not just out of vanity, but because cleanliness is tied to virtue. A tidy house means a disciplined household. It reflects good character as much as good hygiene. Women play a crucial role in maintaining this discipline. Their days begin early, often before the first light enters the windows. Fires must be lit. Bread needs to be prepared. Water must be fetched, heated, then used carefully, since it takes effort to bring more. Laundry is scrubbed with sand, soaked, rinsed, and hung to dry, sometimes frozen stiff in winter winds. Linen is precious and must be protected from stains and insects. Many women take pride not just in their duties, but in how visibly well they perform them. When a neighbor stops by for a visit, she immediately notices whether the pewter plates shine or whether dust has settled on the windowsill. There is a special room in many homes, the front parlor, that looks almost untouched by life. Beautiful chairs arranged neatly, a table covered with a decorative cloth, maybe a painting or two hanging above, or a Delft vase placed carefully in the center. Children rarely play here. Ordinary meals are not eaten here. It remains almost like a small museum within the house, reserved for honored guests, significant occasions, or moments when the family wants to present its best face to the world. Families may be modest in wealth, but they still want to show dignity and respectability when someone steps through the front door. Walk further inside, and everyday life reappears. The kitchen becomes the heart of the household, warm from constant cooking and filled with the rich smells of whatever is simmering on the hearth. Pots and pans hang overhead. Dried herbs dangle from beams. Bread sits cooling on a table. Here, you see the rhythm of meals, which are usually simple, ever extravagant. Breakfast might be bread and cheese. Lunch could be soup or porridge, maybe with fish if it's available. Dinner, the main meal, brings hearty stews or vegetables mixed with whatever the family can afford. Meat is rare, especially for ordinary families. It is something associated with Sundays, holidays, or special achievements. Wealth places itself quietly on the table through spices, sugar, and imported delicacies, not through wasteful abundance. Children quickly learn that nothing goes unused. Food scraps feed animals. Worn clothing is mended repeatedly. Furniture gets repaired instead of replaced. Even candle stubs have value, saved to be melted and reshaped. Dutch culture in this era embodies careful resourcefulness and attitude built from both practicality and religious values. Wastefulness is frowned upon, while moderation is praised. Sit down with the family during a meal, and you notice another important ritual: prayer and gratitude. Before food is touched, a moment of quiet reflection acknowledges that survival is not guaranteed. Ships sink, harvests fail, illness strikes without warning. So each meal carries quiet gratitude as well as nourishment. People may appear calm, But beneath that calm lives constant awareness of how fragile life actually is. And then there is beer, not the strong celebratory drink you might imagine, but a weaker, everyday version that even children sometimes consume. It isn't about intoxication, it's about safety. Water from canals is often polluted and unreliable, while brewing kills harmful bacteria. So the mugs on the table are as practical as they are traditional. Later in the century, coffee and tea begin making their way into households not as ordinary refreshments, but as symbols of sophistication and curiosity. Sitting together to drink them becomes a small ritual of worldliness, reminding families that they are part of something global. Early morning chores give way to late morning routines. In homes tied to trades, the line between domestic life and business blurs again as customers arrive. Shoes are dropped off, cloth is purchased, grain is weighed and sold. Children run errands, learning responsibility early. Girls practice spinning or sewing. Boys help in workshops or carry goods between rooms. Childhood is not idle. Playtime exists, but it weaves around duty rather than replacing it. Life prepares children steadily for adulthood without much sentimentality. Climb the steep stairs to the upper floors, and you'll reach bedrooms. Furniture is sparse but purposeful. A bed covered with heavy blankets sits in one corner, sometimes boxed in by wood to trap warmth. A cradle might rock gently near the mother's side. In some households, people sleep sitting slightly upright, believing it healthier than lying flat. Privacy is limited. Several family members may share the same room, sometimes the same bed, depending on space and means. Clothing is stored carefully. Wardrobes hold garments that must last for years. Colors reflect modest tastes: browns, grays, muted blues. Only the wealthy indulge in brighter fabrics. Each outfit must endure constant mending and patching, stitches marking the quiet labor of hands you rarely see. Look closely, and you find religious touches scattered around the home: a Bible on a table, a small painting with moral imagery, modest reminders of faith. Religion doesn't shout loudly. Religion doesn't shout loudly in this city. Instead, it whispers its way through habits, values, and expectations. Families believe their behavior says something about their spiritual lives. Laziness, extravagance, drunkenness, these are not merely personal flaws. They risk judgment from neighbors, from society, and ultimately from God. Still, behind this moral seriousness, warmth exists. Evenings bring conversation, stories about the day, worries about relatives at sea, laughter when someone shares an amusing mistake. Parents instruct, correct, and guide, but they also show affection through small, unspoken gestures: passing a slice of bread, adjusting a scarf, checking whether the fire still burns strong enough to keep everyone comfortable. Occasionally, the house becomes noisier, filled with visiting relatives. The presence of guests triggers a burst of activity. Better plates are set out. Special food appears, maybe something sweet, if sugar is available. Children are told to behave and remain quiet. Hospitality is taken seriously. The home becomes a stage where respectability is performed, but beneath that well-managed surface, difficulties exist. Fire is a constant threat. Candles, hearths, wooden beams, and narrow staircases create dangerous conditions. A single accident could ignite. An entire neighborhood, disease, too, enters easily. Someone coughs, fever spreads. A physician is called, but doctors in this era are limited in knowledge. Remedies include herbs, bleeding, strange concoctions, and prayers. Families live with vulnerability as an unspoken companion. Even household smells reflect the reality of survival. The scent of cooked cabbage mixes with smoke from peat. Wet wool drying near the fire gives off a damp aroma. Animals kept for food or trade may share close space with the family. Pigs and chickens sometimes stay nearby. Cats prowl for mice. Dogs guard doors. Everything lives close together because space is precious and because this is how families secure what little stability they can. Yet, despite those difficulties, there is beauty in this domestic world. Sunlight filters through leaded windows, breaking into patterns on the floor. The ticking of a clock fills the silence. A needle moves rhythmically through fabric. A mother hums softly as she works. Artists of the Dutch Golden Age later capture these scenes with reverence, not because they are grand, but because they are so ordinary and yet so meaningful. They show women pouring milk, men reading letters, children studying by candlelight. Everyday acts become symbols of peace, discipline, and dignity. Walk outside briefly and peek back in through another window. You might see a house where wealth is more obvious. The furnishings are richer. Paintings by accomplished artists hang on the walls. The table holds imported porcelain, books and maps, signal education and travel. But even here, the rhythm of life is similar. Wealth does not erase discipline. It magnifies expectations. The family becomes even more concerned with maintaining respectability, with appearing as examples of proper society. Servants take on many of the chores, but they too live under strict schedules and rules. Guilds shape this domestic structure. As well, membership in a guild gives craftsmen identity, support, and rules to follow. Inside homes, records are kept carefully: receipts, contracts, apprenticeship papers. Fathers pass trade knowledge to sons. Mothers pass household wisdom to daughters. Skills travel quietly from generation to generation, preserved not in schools, but in kitchens, workshops, and shared labor. There are moments when the household softens and celebrates. Weddings, baptisms, and holidays bring life into rooms traditionally filled with routine. Tables overflow with food, more generous than usual. Songs rise, candles burn late into the night. But such moments feel special precisely because they interrupt, rather than replace, the steady rhythm of everyday duty. A curious visitor wandering through several houses might eventually realize something important. Domestic life in 1600s Amsterdam is not separate from the identity of the city. It is the backbone of it. The order seen in canals begins first at home. The success of trade relies on households functioning smoothly. Merchants can only travel because wives, sisters, servants, and daughters manage everything in their absence. Children grow up absorbing this structure and later reproduce it in their own families. Quietly, invisibly, the home becomes the machine that keeps the city working. As night approaches, the hearth glows softly. Shadows stretch across the room. Someone closes shutters against the chill. Outside, voices grow faint, replaced by the gentle sound of water moving through the canals. Inside, family members settle in for rest. A candle is extinguished, and darkness fills the room, except for a trace of moonlight slipping through the window. Tomorrow will bring the same tasks and the same worries, but there is comfort in routine. There is strength in predictability. Daily life may seem ordinary, yet within its quiet repetition lies the resilience that allowed Amsterdam to rise and thrive during one of the most remarkable periods in its history. And so, while merchants and sailors fill the city's stories, it is in these narrow, tall houses and kitchens, workshops, and modest bedrooms that the true heartbeat of Amsterdam lives, shaped by discipline, care, ingenuity, and the unspoken hope that all of this work will protect the family for one more day, one more season, and one more uncertain year. Work is the rhythm that drives Amsterdam in the 1600s. It hums through the streets, echoes in the shipyards, and fills the workshops from dawn until late evening. Everyone, in one way or another, becomes part of the city's great machine of trade, craftsmanship, and survival. If you stand near the harbor long enough, you begin to understand just how deeply labor shapes identity. Ships line the docks like enormous wooden skeletons, creaking and swaying with the tides. Sailors move among them with practiced motions, carrying ropes, tightening knots, hoisting sails, and checking cargo holds. For many of these men, the sea is both opportunity and threat. Signing on to a voyage with the Dutch East India Company promises wages, adventure, and perhaps a chance to return home with stories and treasures. But the risks are enormous. Months can stretch into years. Storms rise without warning. Disease can spread through cramped quarters. Some sailors leave the harbor full of confidence and never return, their lives simply swallowed by distant oceans. Work on land holds its own dangers, but also structure and routine. In the shipyards, carpenters carve beams, caulkers seal seams with tar, and blacksmiths hammer metal parts that will hold vessels together. Sparks fly, tools thud rhythmically. Orders are shouted across open yards where half-completed ships sit like colossal works in progress. Young apprentices watch closely, learning each step through repetition. They understand that mastering these skills may feed them for a lifetime. The guild system stands behind much of this. Guilds regulate training, ensure standards, and protect trades from chaos. To belong to a guild is to hold a recognized place within society, an identity as important as family name. Walk away from the docks and you enter a world of craftsmen, each specialized, each essential. A cobbler leans over a worn wooden table, shaping leather into shoes. A silversmith bends carefully over a piece of jewelry, engraving tiny patterns into its surface. A carpenter builds furniture meant to last for generations, fitted by hand. In Amsterdam, quality becomes a form of pride. A poorly made object reflects not just failure of skill, but failure of character. Apprentices sit quietly watching, sometimes allowed to practice on scrap material under the watchful eyes of their masters. Patience becomes part of the education. Women's work, though less celebrated publicly, forms the unseen backbone of the economic world. Many households double as businesses. A woman may run a shop while her husband travels. She keeps records, manages customers, negotiates prices, and ensures goods remain in stock. Others spin thread, weave cloth, make candles, brew beer, or sell produce in markets. Widows, in particular, often step fully into roles previously reserved for men, continuing family trades to support children and protect property. Society expects women to remain modest and dutiful, yet the truth is more complex. Without their constant labor and quiet management, the city's economy would collapse. Inside, counting houses and offices, another kind of work. Clerks sit behind desks with quill pens and ledgers, recording numbers row after row, calculating profits, debts, and future investments. Paper rustles, ink stains, fingertips. Here, work is about precision, trust, and memory. A single mistake could cost a merchant thousands of guilders. These clerks track ships leaving and arriving, calculate insurance costs, and keep contracts organized in meticulous bundles tied with string. Their world may seem less dangerous than the shipyards, but pressure weighs heavily. Reputation determines everything. A dishonest or careless bookkeeper quickly finds himself without employment, perhaps even without respect in the community. Merchants themselves act like strategists in a massive game of risk. They rarely move cargo with their own hands. Instead, they move money, influence, and plans. They invest in voyages, purchase shares, arrange contracts, and meet potential partners in taverns or quiet rooms above shops. Their success depends on news report about weather patterns, word of conflict in a distant port, rumors of pirate activity, fluctuations in the price of sugar or spices, information. For immigrants arriving in Amsterdam, work becomes both opportunity and trial. Many come because they have been pushed out of their homes by war, persecution, or economic hardship. They arrive with hope and fear intertwined, seeking safety and the chance to start again. Some take humble jobs unloading cargo, sweeping warehouses, or helping in shipyards. Others bring rare skills, metalwork, glassmaking, or specialized crafts. The city offers space for them, but not without rule. They must adapt, learn local customs, and earn trust. Over time, some rise to respected positions, demonstrating how work can transform a stranger into a citizen. Religion influences working life, too, though often indirectly. Many believe success reflects discipline and moral integrity. Hard work becomes not just a necessity, but a kind of virtue. Sermons emphasize moderation, honesty, responsibility, and charity. Wealth is not condemned outright, but it comes with expectations to support the poor, to fund community projects, to avoid flaunting riches irresponsibly. The notion that a person's labor honors both family and faith remains deeply embedded. In daily life, children encounter this culture of labor from an early age. Rather than spending long days at leisure, they shadow adults and absorb responsibilities. A young boy helps carry firewood, runs messages across the neighborhood, or learns the basics of his father's trade. A young girl assists in kitchens, cares for younger siblings, practices sewing, or helps manage the shop front. Play still exists: games with hoops, wooden dolls, winter skating, but it nestles between duties. Over time, children internalize the lesson that life functions through discipline, not indulgence. When adulthood arrives, the transition feels natural rather than abrupt. Artists to belong to this world of work. They may appear romantic in retrospect, but in the moment they operate like skilled tradesmen who survive through commissions. Painters study light, assemble pigments, and negotiate with wealthy patrons. They paint portraits of merchants, domestic interiors, landscapes, and biblical scenes. Their studios smell of oil and canvas. Apprentices grind pigments and stretch canvases, learning gradually. Art captures daily existence market scenes, family gatherings, quiet domestic moments, reflecting how work and ordinary routines define society. These painters observe closely, translating the labor-filled reality into images that still speak centuries later in marketplaces. Activity surges constantly. Farmers from surrounding regions bring vegetables, butter, eggs, and cheese. Fishermen haul baskets filled with fresh herring. Traders spread out fabrics from distant lands. Buyers haggle, exchange coins, and inspect items with practiced eyes. Market inspectors circulate, checking weights and prices, ensuring fairness. Here, work meets community. News spreads through casual conversation. Someone mentions a shipwreck. Another talks about a new tax, while others whisper rumors about political tensions. Every sale becomes part of a larger web of economic life. Even leisure is connected to labor in subtle ways. Men gather at taverns not simply to relax, but to discuss business and secure future deals. Social visits often double as networking opportunities. Friendships can evolve into partnerships. Rivalries can turn into financial competition. Behind laughter and storytelling lies constant awareness of risk and opportunity. But not everyone prospers. Some work tirelessly yet remain poor laborers, whose wages barely cover food and rent widows with too many mouths to feed. Elderly people without family support. For them, work feels like a never-ending struggle to avoid hunger and shame. Charitable institutions attempt to provide relief. Orphanages house parentless children, training them for trades that may later sustain them. Almshouses support the elderly. These organizations, often funded by wealthy citizens, enforce strict rules emphasizing order, humility, and moral behavior. Even charity is organized with discipline. At times, crises test the resilience of the working world. A sudden drop in market prices can ruin merchants. A fire might destroy a workshop. Plague can sweep through neighborhoods, stopping business entirely as fear spreads faster than good. During such moments, people discover the thin line separating stability from collapse. Neighbors rely on one another more than ever. Guilds provide mutual aid. Families tighten bonds, sharing food and resources. Work slows, then gradually resumes, as life demands persistence. For sailors returning after long voyages, reintegration into city life can feel strange. They step onto familiar streets, carrying wages, scars, and memories of distant storms. Some head straight to taverns to celebrate survival. Others go home quietly, greeted with relief by families unsure whether they would ever return. Their stories mix heroism with hardship, endless days of monotony at sea. Hunger when provisions spoiled, fear when ships groaned under heavy winds, yet many still sign up again. The promise of wages and the pull of adventure overpower the danger. Meanwhile, the presence of the Dutch East India Company looms over nearly every economic decision. It represents power, ambition, and vast trading networks stretching to Asia, Africa, and beyond. Investors buy shares. Shipbuilders construct massive vessels specifically for its voyages. Sailors risk their lives aboard its ships. Spices, textiles, and exotic goods flow back into Amsterdam, enriching the city. Critics murmur about exploitation, danger, and greed, but the company remains central to the economy. Few people remain untouched by its influence. One of the most fascinating aspects of work in Amsterdam is the quiet dignity with which people accept their roles. A street sweeper may earn little, but he understands that without clean roads, business suffers. A midwife called at unpredictable hours holds communities together by guiding births safely. A teacher instructs children in reading, writing, and moral habits, shaping future merchants and craftsmen. Each person contributes to a vast, interlocking system where pride is found not in grand titles, but in honest work well done, day after day. In a city that believes ordinary effort builds an extraordinary world, complex systems shape every life in Amsterdam, whether people realize it or not. As evening approaches, work shifts but does not end. Bakers prepare dough for the next morning. Guards patrol certain areas of the city. Sailors on anchored ships remain responsible for maintenance and watch duty. In wealthier homes, servants continue working long after families retire, cleaning utensils, tending fires, and preparing for the next day. Only in the quiet hours before dawn does the city briefly exhale. And even then, some night labor continues unseen. In all of this, opportunity mingles with uncertainty. Amsterdam offers chances unavailable in many other places: the ability to rise through trade, to establish independence, to build a reputation based on effort rather than lineage. Yet every chance contains risk. A sudden illness, a miscalculated investment, or an unlucky voyage can destroy years of progress. People learn to balance ambition with caution. They diversify investments, join guilds for security, and maintain networks of trust. Reputation becomes currency. A single betrayal can lock someone out of future work. That delicate balance between hope and danger defines the psychology of the city. Citizens push outward, exploring oceans, inventing financial systems, experimenting with commerce. But at the same time, they cling tightly to structure, rules, discipline, and community expectations, as though they understand that ambition without order would send everything crashing down. When historians look back at Amsterdam in the 1600s, they see wealth, innovation, and global influence. Yet beneath those grand achievements lies this everyday world of effort, calloused hands gripping tools, ink-stained fingers scratching numbers onto parchment, tired feet walking home after long hours, women calculating costs while stirring pots of stew, children practicing tasks that will one day define them. This world is quieter than the epic tales of exploration, but it is the foundation that makes such stories possible. As night finally wraps around the city, the last shops shutter, the final carts roll into storage, and only a few lanterns flicker. Near the harbor, you might stand on a bridge and sense the stillness settling over the water. But just beneath that calm lies anticipation. With the next sunrise, the work will begin again. Ships will set sail, merchants will bargain, artisans will carve, and families will continue weaving their lives into the great complicated fabric of Amsterdam's golden age. Work is not simply how people survive. It is how they participate in the grand story unfolding around them, a story written not by kings, but by hands, hearts, and endless determination. Religion and public order in 1600s Amsterdam were not abstract concepts. They were woven into every chore, every marketplace conversation, every knock on a neighbor's door. To live in the city meant constantly balancing freedom with discipline. Amsterdam was unusually tolerant compared with most European cities. But tolerance did not mean chaos. Instead, the city depended on the idea that a morally upright community, watchful, neat, organized, was the key to prosperity and stability. Most citizens belonged, at least nominally, to the Dutch Reformed Church. Its teachings emphasized modesty, hard work, and a life free of unnecessary extravagance. Even if many people failed to live up to that ideal every day, they still felt its weight. Sunday mornings transformed the city. Streets quieted, filed into churches with plain wooden interiors and long wooden benches. There were no gold altars or elaborate statues. Preachers spoke for long stretches, warning against pride, greed, and moral laziness. Children fidgeted while parents listened with solemn attention, aware that everyone around them was paying attention not only to the sermon but to each other's behavior. To skip church regularly was not just neglectful, it sent a signal that you might also neglect your duties in other parts of life at the same time. Amsterdam welcomed Catholics, Lutherans, Jews, and various Protestant minorities. They often could not worship openly with grand buildings, but they built hidden churches inside houses, attics, or discreet halls. These communities paid taxes, contributed to trade, and participated in civic life. The authorities preferred order and economic contribution over harsh religious persecution, which had caused so much turmoil elsewhere in Europe. So long as alternative faiths remained relatively quiet, they were largely tolerated. A delicate balance existed. People knew they could believe differently, but they also knew they were expected not to disturb the peace, because reputation mattered. So deeply, neighbors monitored one another, not always maliciously, but with the sense that everyone's behavior affected the entire community. Excessive drunkenness, street brawls, or displays of laziness were not just personal failings. They were potential cracks in the city's moral foundation. If someone repeatedly neglected their responsibilities, the problem did not remain private for long. Complaints could travel from neighbor to magistrate, and the offender might face a fine or be called before local authorities to explain themselves. Shame, in many ways, worked more effectively than police. Charity, too, reflected this blend of compassion and control. Wealthy merchants donated funds for orphanages, almshouses, and hospitals. On the surface, this generosity sprang from religious duty, care for the poor, the sick, and the abandoned. But there was also a practical motive. A city full of beggars and idle wanderers was a city at risk. By feeding and housing those who had fallen into misfortune, Amsterdam also maintained stability. Orphanages gave children strict schedules, discipline, and a basic education. Almshouses provided rooms for elderly widows or impoverished citizens who had no family. But they also imposed rules about behavior, silence, and prayer. Even charity came with expectations of order. Yet, despite these efforts, everyday life remained. rough at the edges. Animals, pigs, dogs, chickens roamed through alleys. Fish guts, broken crates, and spoiled vegetables sometimes piled up along the canals. Laws existed against dumping waste, but enforcement fluctuated. Some families used chamber pots and emptied them out of windows. Others threw garbage into water, trusting the slow current to carry it away. The city hired workers to dredge canals and clean streets, and inspectors were tasked with checking wells, markets, and meat shops. Still, during busy seasons, the sheer volume of people and trade overwhelmed these systems. Disease lurked constantly. Outbreaks of plague, fever, and smallpox swept through neighborhoods without warning. Everyone had their own whispered theories about why illness struck. Many believed it was God's punishment for sin. Others blamed foul air, stagnant water, or unlucky contact with strangers arriving on ships. Doctors themselves possessed only partial understanding, guided by ancient medical theories that emphasized the balance of bodily humors. They prescribed bleeding, purging, and herbal mixtures that sometimes did little more than exhaust patients. Even so, people clung to these remedies because they offered a sense of control in moments of terror. Midwives and barber surgeons played crucial roles in the community. Midwives assisted women through childbirth, drawing on experience passed down through generations. Their authority, however, was watched closely. Officials required licenses and parish endorsements, worried that untrained helpers might cause harm or encourage superstition. Barber surgeons, meanwhile, cut hair, pulled teeth, and performed crude surgical procedures, amputations, lancing infected wounds, setting broken bones. Their tools were simple and pain relief minimal. Many operations depended on speed, strength, and prayer. Successful procedures earned gratitude and reputation. Failures were often accepted as fate. Public health measures gradually grew stricter, especially when epidemics struck. Quarantine houses isolated the sick. Ships arriving from infected ports could be held for days before crews were allowed into the city. Inspectors posted signs on infected homes, and families might be barred from leaving. These measures were painful and frightening, but Amsterdam learned through bitter experience that decisive action could save lives. The city's leaders were not scientists in the modern sense, yet they recognized patterns and tried to respond. With increasingly organized systems, religion intertwined with these crises in complicated ways. Ministers urged their congregations to interpret outbreaks as warnings to return to piety. Special days of fasting and prayer were declared. Families filled churches asking for mercy, but faith also provided resilience. In times of death, rituals, processions, simple burials, shared meals reminded people that life, however fragile, still had meaning. Without this framework, the cycle of fear could easily have overwhelmed the city. Law and punishment reflected similar priorities. Amsterdam did not rely on massive armies of guards. Instead, civic militias and night watchmen patrolled streets, and guilds supervised members' behavior. Courts handled cases ranging from theft to slander. Judges might impose fines, temporary imprisonment, or public humiliation, such as standing in the pillory. Harsh executions did occur, especially for serious crimes. but they were meant to demonstrate that order was non-negotiable. Courts cared as much about preserving the city's moral image as they did about the specific details of a single offense. Women navigated this blend of structure and expectation every day. They were expected to maintain clean households, raise children with discipline, and exercise thrift. A woman known for gossip, untidiness, or frequent tavern visits risked social isolation, yet women also wielded quiet power. They organized family finances, negotiated at markets, managed apprentices in small shops, and formed networks of mutual help. Religious charity groups, led by women, provided clothing, food, and nursing care for the needy. In this way, women were central guardians of both morality and survival. Children grew up in this atmosphere of watchfulness. Many began working early, helping in shops, kitchens, or on boats. Education focused on reading, writing, and religious instruction. Teachers emphasized obedience and the virtues of diligence. At the same time, children still found space to laugh, to play in streets and on frozen canals during winter. Their games reflected the world around the miniature trade, ships, pretend markets, and imaginary courts. They learned early that success in Amsterdam depended on discipline, but also on cleverness and stamina. Markets, meanwhile, served as both economic engines and moral theaters. Inspectors checked the accuracy of scales and examined meat for signs of spoilage. Selling rotten goods was not merely dishonest, it endangered the community. Public announcements warned citizens when contaminated produce or water sources were discovered. Merchants who repeatedly cheated customers could be banned from trading. Order here was not abstract policy, was a daily negotiation between survival and fairness. Hospitals of the period did not resemble modern institutions. They were often crowded spaces run by religious or civic organizations. Beds lined open halls where nurses and attendants moved between patients. Treatments were basic, and infection spread easily. Yet hospitals represented a serious attempt to care for those who had nowhere else to turn. Many patients died within their walls, but others received enough support to recover. The presence of structured medical care, however imperfect, signaled that the city believed in collective responsibility. The canal's lifelines of commerce also posed health risks. City authorities introduced regulations to control dumping and improved drainage. They built sluices to flush stagnant water out toward larger bodies of water and dredged channels to keep them moving. Over time, these interventions reduced some of the worst hazards. Though the canals never became entirely clean, people living along them developed habits of vigilance, boiling water, storing rainwater, or relying on beer because it had been boiled during brewing. Even leisure was shaped by notions of proper behavior. Taverns were allowed, but they were expected to operate within boundaries. Drinking excessively, gambling recklessly, or disturbing neighbors could result in fines. Festivals and fairs, while joyful, were supervised by magistrates eager to prevent disorder. Music, dancing, and celebration were tolerated as long as they did not threaten public peace or moral norms. In this environment, Amsterdammers learned to enjoy life within lines drawn by tradition and authority. Immigrants arriving from abroad encountered both opportunity and scrutiny. They brought new languages, trades, and customs, enriching the city's culture. but they also had to conform to the rules that defined civic life: pay taxes, respect religious boundaries, maintain cleanliness, avoid criminal activity. Integration often occurred gradually through marriage, guild membership, or participation in local charities. Over time, these newcomers became part of the same fabric of responsibility and restraint. Behind all of this lay an unspoken understanding. Prosperity depended on self-control. Wealth from overseas trade tempted sit. The fear of moral decay was powerful, perhaps stronger, precisely because the city had tasted such rapid growth. Families passed these lessons down through generations. Grandparents told children of past plagues and famines, of fires that swept through wooden neighborhoods, of ships lost at sea that left widows and orphans behind. These stories carried warnings. Fortune was fragile, and the only defense against disaster beyond prayer was collective discipline. Sweep your stoop, mind your accounts, attend church, avoid idle gossip, respect the rules. Such small actions added up to something larger: city capable of surviving crises. And survive it did. Even during epidemics, even when economic downturns shook merchant houses, Amsterdam bounced back with remarkable resilience. Inspectors refined their systems. Hospitals improved record-keeping. The city invested in infrastructure. Communities continued to rely on networks of charity and faith. This capacity to adapt, to mix practical regulation with heartfelt belief, defined much of the city's strength. Daily life in 1600s Amsterdam, seen through the lens of religion, order, and health, was therefore not a story of rigid oppression nor of wild freedom. It was a constant negotiation. People prayed earnestly, yet broke rules now and then. Magistrates enforced discipline, yet showed flexibility when circumstances demanded. Families feared disease, yet persisted in building routines, cleaning homes, and checking on neighbors. The city's rhythm: church bells, market cries, patrol footsteps, doctor visits, charity collections formed a living system that held everyone together. To walk those streets was to feel watched, guided, and protected all at once. The same neighbor who reported your noisy argument might arrive later with soup during an illness. The same city officials who fine you for dumping waste might also organize relief when plague entered your quarter. This mixture of control and care created a society that could withstand repeated blows from nature, economics, and human folly. And so, amid the simple wooden pews, the crowded hospitals, the quarantined homes, and the orderly markets, Amsterdam forged its identity. Faith shaped conscience. Rules shaped behavior. Health measures, however experimental, shaped survival together. They formed the quiet, disciplined backbone of a city whose achievements still echoes centuries later, reminder that behind the grandeur of trade and art stood thousands of ordinary people striving day after day to live decently in a dangerous world. Crime, leisure, and culture in 1600s Amsterdam formed a strange and compelling triangle, each shaping the others in subtle ways. The city was wealthy, crowded, and constantly in motion, so it naturally attracted troublemakers, along with dreamers, merchants, and scholars. Yet it also produced one of the richest cultural landscapes in Europe. To understand daily life, you have to imagine how people navigated temptation, entertainment, and creativity, while always aware that neighbors, magistrates, and church elders were watching. The markets, which drew people from dawn until late afternoon, were vibrant and noisy but also dangerous. Sailors arrived with wages in their pockets. Servants came to buy food. Merchants called out prices as wagons rattled past. In such crowds, pickpockets could blend in easily. They slipped through groups, bumping shoulders and tugging loose purses from belts. Experienced thieves worked in pairs. One created distraction, while the other moved in and vanished. When such thefts were discovered, shouts of "Stop, thief!" traveled quickly, and the nearest men might form a quick chase. If the thief was caught, the punishment could be humiliating standing in the pillory or being whipped publicly, not only as a penalty, but as a warning to others that crime would be met with shame. Smuggling was another reality of life. With trade booming, rules existed about what could be imported, taxed, or sold. Some sailors and merchants resented those restrictions. Hidden compartments inside barrels or under ship decks carried goods that avoided official customs checks. Tobacco, silk, luxury fabrics, and sometimes weapons moved quietly through private warehouses. Authorities knew it happened, and sometimes they turned a cautious blind eye if the smugglers were otherwise respectable citizens. But if a case became too obvious, inspectors cracked down hard, seizing goods and issuing ruinous fines. Economic success rested on regulations, and the city could not afford to appear weak. Violence occasionally flared, especially in taverns. After too much drink, arguments over debts, insults, or personal grudges escalated into fistfights or knife attacks. Most disputes never reached the courts, however. Friends pulled combatants apart. People valued stability. Too many disruptive incidents risked attention from magistrates, which no one wanted. Amsterdam's informal system of social pressure worked hand in hand with official law enforcement. What made the city unique was that crime existed, yet widespread fear did not dominate everyday conversation. Instead, most people trusted that the combination of communal vigilance and civic justice would keep the streets relatively safe. Night watchmen carried lanterns down alleyways, calling out the hours. Militia groups trained periodically both to defend the city and to symbolize civic unity. Their parades with drums and flags reassured residents that order stood ready if needed. This sense of shared responsibility discouraged the rise of dangerous criminal networks. There was too much light, too many eyes, and too many people invested in preserving their livelihoods. Leisure, meanwhile, offered escape from relentless work. After long hours at docks, workshops, or market stalls, people sought places to talk, drink, laugh, and release tension. Taverns formed the backbone of social life. Inside, long wooden tables hosted customers from various backgrounds, shipwrights rubbing shoulders with merchants, soldiers joking with fishermen, and travelers exchanging stories about foreign ports. The air filled with tobacco smoke, a new habit arriving from the Americas, while tankards of beer passed from hand to hand. Dice games, cards, and simple board games occupied small corners. Music sometimes drifted through the room, played by itinerant musicians who relied on donations. Taverns were more than entertainment spots. They served as business hubs and social networks. Deals were struck over mugs of ale. News traveled here faster than through official channels. Rumors about distant wars, shipwrecks, and new trade routes leaped from table to table. At the same time, taverns carried moral risk. Excessive drinking could lead to irresponsibility, lost wages, or family hardship. Religious leaders warned constantly against the dangers of such spaces, insisting that moderation defined a respectable citizen. As a result, taverns learned to operate within limits. The owners understood they could lose their license if too many fights erupted or too many complaints reached the authorities. Leisure coexisted with discipline, always hovering between joy and caution. Theaters added another layer of entertainment and controversy. Stage productions attracted enthusiastic audiences from across the city. Comedies poked fun at human weaknesses. Historical dramas presented stories of heroes, rulers, and moral dilemmas. The stage offered a mirror to society, showing exaggerated versions of daily behavior, ambition, and hypocrisy. Critics feared that theater encouraged vanity or idleness, but many citizens defended it as a place where people could learn through enjoyment. Audiences did not sit silently. They reacted loudly, laughing, whispering, sometimes debating scenes out loud. A performance was a shared experience, uniting strangers for a brief yet memorable evening. Festivals and fairs punctuated the year with bursts of color. During religious holidays or civic celebrations, streets filled with decorations. Vendors sold sweets, roasted nuts, and seasonal treats. Musicians played, dancers twirled, and children darted between adults with excited energy. At winter festivals, frozen canals transformed into joyful playgrounds. Skaters glided across the ice, some gracefully, others clumsily, while vendors set up small fires nearby to warm hands with hot drinks. Despite cold weather and hard lives, these events reminded people of community joy. Such gatherings, however, still remained under watch. Officials patrolled festivals to ensure they did not slip into uncontrolled chaos. Even joy had rules. Culture blossomed in more private settings, too. Inside many homes, evenings were filled not just with chores, but with quiet forms of enrichment. Reading grew increasingly common as literacy improved. Families gathered around candlelight while someone read aloud from the Bible, a moral treatise, or a popular novel. Printed pamphlets circulated widely, offering commentary on politics, religion, or science. These texts stimulated discussion, encouraging citizens to think critically and share opinions. Word of mouth and print together created a buzzing, intellectual atmosphere. Art ranked among Amsterdam's proudest cultural achievements. Painters captured everything: portraits of wealthy families, bustling market scenes, serene landscapes, and intimate household moments. Unlike earlier eras, where art served mainly the church or nobility, the 1600s saw a broader market. Middle-class buyers filled their homes with paintings that reflected their world. A butcher might purchase an image of livestock or farm life. A ship captain might hang a seascape showing waves breaking against sturdy vessels. Art did not just decorate walls, it reinforced identity and aspiration. Workshops buzzed with apprentices grinding pigments, stretching canvases, and learning techniques from master painters. Artistic success. In this environment, creativity intertwined with trade. Mirroring the city's commercial spirit, booksellers and publishers thrived as well. Amsterdam became a hub for printing because its relative tolerance allowed works banned elsewhere to find refuge. Philosophers and scientists saw the city as a place where new ideas had a chance to spread. Libraries slowly grew not just in monasteries or universities, but in private homes. Those collections revealed interests ranging from navigation and astronomy to poetry and theology. The printed word carried culture beyond elite circles, fostering a more informed public. Another fascinating dimension of culture was curiosity about the wider world. Ships brought exotic shells, spices, ivory, and plants. Merchants collected unusual objects and displayed them in cabinets of curiosities, small private museums where visitors marveled at natural wonders. These collections reflected pride in global connections, but also deep fascination with nature and science. They hinted at rising curiosity that would eventually contribute to broader scientific revolutions. Visitors left such rooms buzzing with stories, eager to describe what they had seen. Leisure also included the simpler pleasures of visiting neighbors. Social etiquette mattered. Guests removed hats, accepted refreshments politely, and admired the household's tidiness. Conversation might revolve around family news, trade prospects, or local gossip. These gatherings strengthened bonds and eased tensions created by hard work. Hospitality served as both kindness and strategy, reinforcing alliances that could become useful in business or emergencies. Children participated in cultural life in their own way. Street games developed into miniature versions of adult activities. Boys raced small wooden ships in canals. Girls organized pretend markets or household chores. On winter days, children practiced skating, laughing as they fell and rose again. They attended festivals with wide eyes, absorbing traditions that would guide them as they grew into adults. Even when they worked alongside parents, children still carved moments of play into daily routines, proving that childhood joy persisted beneath practical obligations. Despite all this flourishing culture, crime remained an ever-present worry. When darkness fell, when lamps flickered out, and watchmen alone patrolled, fears emerged of lurking thieves and mischief. Superstitions mixed with reality. Some believed criminals operated with help from dark forces or bad luck. Others simply recognized that desperate people might resort to desperate acts. Families secured doors with bars. Dogs barked at unfamiliar footsteps. Safety often depended on knowing one's neighbors and trusting they would notice anything unusual. Courts handled not only violent cases, but also disputes over insults, broken contracts, or slander. Reputation, again, held enormous power. Words could damage livelihoods as surely as theft. If someone accused a merchant of cheating or a family of dishonesty, legal action might follow. Settlements sometimes required public apologies to restore honor. These procedures reveal how strongly Amsterdam valued social harmony. Conflict resolution did not always demand severe punishment. Sometimes it demanded public reconciliation. Interestingly, crime stories themselves became a kind of cultural thread. Ballads and pamphlets describe dramatic robberies, daring escapes, and stern punishments. These tales served both as warnings and as entertainment. People discussed them as cautionary examples. See what happens if you cross the line, yet also treated them as gripping dramas. The line between moral instruction and storytelling blurred frequently, capturing audiences in both taverns and homes. As the century progressed, the boundaries between crime and economic survival sometimes grew thin. A poor laborer who stole bread might provoke sympathy from neighbors. Authorities had to balance compassion with deterrence. Too harsh a reaction risked angering communities. Too lenient a response risked inviting more wrongdoing. The legal system adapted slowly, guided by case-by-case judgment. Judges and magistrates, often drawn from wealthy merchant families, saw themselves as guardians of civic order rather than mere enforcers. Their decisions shaped the rhythm of everyday justice. Religion continued to influence leisure and moral behavior. Sunday remained a day of restrained activity. Many taverns closed or operated quietly. Families attended church, visited relatives, and avoided noisy amusements. Critics labeled theaters and certain games as spiritually dangerous, while others argued that honest recreation kept within bounds refreshed the soul. This debate never fully ended. People learned to measure their own habits carefully, seeking enjoyment without attracting accusations of frivolity or sin. Music quietly enriched domestic life. Lutes, violins, and small harpsichords appeared in better-off homes. Young men and women learned to play instruments and sing simple songs. Music lessons offered refinement and increased chances of social acceptance. At gatherings, someone might perform and receive appreciative applause. These moments, though private, cultivated a sense of culture that extended far beyond the public sphere. Sporting pastimes existed, too, in formal and community-driven forms. Ice skating dominated winters, but other activities included archery, contests, ball games, and foot races. Militia companies staged target competitions that blended training with celebration. Winners earned modest prizes or public recognition. Such events fostered friendly rivalry and civic pride, encouraging physical skill alongside cooperation. Into this tapestry stepped travelers, sailors, and foreigners bearing tales of distant cultures. Coffeehouses and tea rooms slowly appeared, inspired by Middle Eastern and Asian customs. These establishments created new spaces for conversation, more restrained than taverns, yet lively with debate. Men discussed philosophy, trade, and news, sipping beverages that symbolized sophistication and modernity. The very act of drinking coffee or tea became a statement about curiosity and openness to the world. Women's leisure, though often constrained by domestic duties, carried its own importance. They gathered for sewing circles, shared recipes, exchanged advice, and discussed neighborhood affairs. These gatherings fostered resilience, solidarity, and a quiet cultural life that shaped the city as surely as ships and ledgers did.